Welcome back to another episode of App Stories. Today's show is brought to you by Memberful. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. We had a great discussion during the pre-show today, all about ways you could deal with your now semi-redundant studio display. I don't know if it's entirely redundant.
Oh, I thought you were gonna say ways to spend my money.
Oh, well, there is that too.
Yeah.
I did. Part of my solution is for you to spend lots of money. I mean, definitely multiple thousands of dollars.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're
very
welcome.
kind of you.
It's easy for me to do that. And, I just wanted to plant the seed and give you a time to think about it and save up for it is all I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be a good friend. But if you'd like to hear what that was all about, you can subscribe to App Stories Plus by going to appstories.plus, or you could become a Club Premier member. Club Mac Stories has all sorts of perks, including, if you're a Club Premier member, App Stories Plus is thrown in as part of the package. We've got a bunch of other stuff like the Discord server and special articles periodically and all kinds of things going on with the club. But if you go to plus.club, you can learn more about it and get App Stories Plus that way too. All right, Federico, today we're going to talk about design. We haven't talked about design for a while.
Yes. You had this interesting idea of exploring the latest design trends in Apple's recent apps and visionOS. They have a brand new platform, and what those design changes and decisions may suggest about the future of Apple design on other platforms, which I think is a fun topic.
Yeah, it is, because you can always see, usually when we get to WWDC in a few months, we will look back and we'll say, oh, now I see. That was in the journal app, or that was in the sports app, or that was in classical, or whatever it happened to be. And now we've got, I think, potentially more breadcrumbs than ever before, because not only do we have a handful of new apps from Apple, we also have an entirely new OS. We have visionOS. And while it is very much tailor-made for interaction in that sort of virtual environment, I do think that there are elements of what's happened in visionOS that do translate to other systems. And so I want to talk a little bit about visionOS today as well.
Do you want to start with a sports app?
I was going to say, I'm going to do the sports app. I'm not, look, it's funny because, there are a lot of people in our audience, I will venture to say, who don't care about the sports app. And I don't particularly either. There was a time in my life when I followed various sports very closely. Lately, not so much.
Which sports?
So I was once very into college basketball because I went to a college called Duke here in North Carolina, which has a historically very good basketball team that most of the rest...
Eagles. No, I got that wrong, I guess.
No, Blue Devils.
Devils.
Here's a fun fact. The Blue Devils of Duke were originally called the Blue Methodists, which that makes no sense. A bunch of blue religious people. But they changed them from Methodists to Devils. They kind of went the other end of the spectrum with that mascot. But in any event, that's a fun fact about North Carolina. Those kind of fun facts you usually get on Mac Stories Unwind or other podcasts, but that's just a taste for anybody who has not listened to Unwind and would like to do that. I'm full of the promos today, Federico.
Yeah. You're excellent at this. So anyway, sports.
Sports.
You're not into sports anymore.
No, I was into college basketball. I've been into hockey. I've been into various things, football at times. But what's interesting about this app, I think, is that it's a very simple app, first of all. You don't have a lot going on here. You've got a single view with a kind of like a segmented control up at the top that says, yesterday, today, and upcoming. My yesterday and today are empty, so I have to go to upcoming because the only team I have, I guess I have two teams in here just to test it out. But it's a single list of games. And if you go through and tap on one of the games, you see the lineups and you see the various. Right now, because my teams aren't playing, I have just conference information for these basketball teams. But the way it's designed is when you tap into a game, there is an animation up at the top, and it's a card-like interface. This is very much, the typical Apple card-like interface, but it's a card that doesn't just extend up a little ways from the bottom like you see in something like Maps. It's the entire view of the app. And you can swipe back and forth between multiple, if you have multiple things listed, you don't have to go back to the original list. You can just swipe back and forth. So there's an extra element of navigation that way as well. And then the other thing that I think is sort of interesting about it is that there is an animation behind the top of the card. So the top of the card will have, here's one that's the Charlotte Hornets versus the Washington Wizards, which is an NBA game that will take place on Friday.
Okay.
All right. And the Hornets have kind of an aqua color and the Wizards have a red. And behind the two teams and the time, it's got this animation where there's a gradient of the aqua and the red that are kind of waving behind the two teams.
Yeah, I just set it up for the Warriors on my iPhone, and there's a gold gradient because that's the color of the Warriors.
Right. And it's not just that there's kind of this back and forth between the two colors in the center of the card. There's kind of an undulation behind each of the teams too that's a little bit like a flag. And if you look very, very carefully, you can see that there's a texture there too, which I know the folks at Lickability did kind of a breakdown of this, and they looked into some of the files in this app, and there is kind of a canvas type of cloth background texture that's being used there. Like if you look really carefully, you can see it. You have to really put your face up pretty close to it.
Yeah, it kind of looks like a piece of cloth. I guess it's what is it supposed to stand, like a jersey or
a
like
jersey or a flag maybe?
Or a flag, yeah.
That's what I was thinking. I don't know. I mean, but it gives it some animation and it gives some life and a little bit of depth to the card that you don't normally have. And that's one of the first things I wanted to talk about is this. I mean, we don't usually see, I don't think, a lot of this sort of, I'd call it like gratuitous animation on the iPhone, because I think part of that is the origins of the iPhone where, the very first iPhone had trouble even loading a web page fast enough to avoid a checkerboard. And so animation is an expensive thing on a phone. It uses up battery, it uses up, processor power. But I think we've gotten to a point with the iPhone processors that Apple can go a little wild. They can do a little animation that's a little bit more, it's a constant animation. It's not just like, a button depressing or something swooshing off to the side or something like that. It's just going to sit there and animate, even if you're just reading through a list of statistics, which I think is kind of nice. And I expect we'll see more of that.
Yeah, I think there are some interesting ideas in this app that I just played around for just a couple of minutes. First thought is that it's very information dense.
Yes,
and
very.
I mean, makes sense, right? You're watching it's a live scores and like stats app, so you're packing a lot of numbers and characters on a single screen. I want to be on the record saying that the betting odds segment is gross, like that section, like why it just feels unapple-y to have gambling right there front and center.
It's a very American thing these days, but I hear you. I don't particularly care for it either.
But so a couple of things that are really fascinating. So this app really feels like it's one of those Apple apps that sort of owns its identity, right? It's a sports app, and so it's meant to look like a sports app. Most Apple apps that you have on the system, like Safari doesn't obviously look like an actual, going on a safari. Notes, which, used to look like an agenda of sorts, like a skeuomorphic agenda, doesn't look like that anymore.
Right.
Most Apple apps, they have a very neutral look. This one, with these accents and color accents and the texture, it looks like a sports app, which I appreciate. I think it's interesting when you tap on a game, how the game opens as a card.
Yep.
It's got a grab indicator at the top, and as you scroll up, the card fills the screen and the title bar pops down from the status bar. I think it's a really nice animation, and this card transition I think we could realistically see in other system apps in the future. And also how, as you scroll the game detail page, the segmented control, so you have the summary, play-by-play, and the box score, how the segmented control sort of anchors itself to the title bar right below it. I think that's also a really, really nice touch.
Yeah, this is a much more, I guess it's a much more sophisticated table view in a lot of ways. I mean,
It is.
You know what I mean? That's it's changed quite a bit. And you're right. That's to aid in the information density here.
The other thing I will mention about the sports app is they have two instances of a button in the top right corner of the app in the title bar. In the home view, it's called My Teams.
Right.
And when you open the My Teams page, it becomes a Manage button. In both instances, that button is a pill-shaped button with a shape around it, which is different from the other buttons on iOS that are usually just blue text.
Right. And it's also, it takes on the background color of
it does.
Of everything around it. And what I also find interesting about the My Teams button is that it has what looks like a grabber next to it, but it's not what it is really. You know what I mean?
It's not a grabber. It's
it's just showing you that there's something underneath there, I suppose, which is another list, which is the manage list to manage your teams and so forth.
The use of the animation with the texture, it almost reminds me in a way of it kind of looks like a GPU sort of GPU powered animation that is similar to the also what looks like GPU powered animation for configuring the action button in settings.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought of that.
It looks like Apple leveraging more and more the graphical power of the iPhone's system on a chip to say, hey, you know what?
That's definitely what's happening.
We can do these sorts of things now. So another case of a really fancy animation that looks to be GPU powered, and that maybe we're gonna see more and more in the future. I like these kinds of details.
I do too. And I mean, the thing is here is that it's interesting to me that the standard controls are very much in the background. The most standard pieces of this are the table view on the main page, which lists all the games, which is basically just a table view with cells, but the cells have a lot of information in them. And then when you tap through, you get a detail view. And so the card is not something that's unfamiliar, but both of those controls are being used a little differently here than we've seen in a lot of other apps.
Yeah.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Memberful. Memberful is best-in-class membership software used by the web's biggest creators, publishers, and media companies. If you're building a membership website for a client, Memberful handles the hard stuff so you can complete your builds quickly and your clients can focus on creating content while earning revenue with ease. We've been using Memberful for years at Mac Stories. It's what the club is built on, and it's been fantastic. It's grown with us as we've added features to the club, and it's got wonderful integrations and APIs that allow us to use it in a bunch of different ways. Memberful protects members-only content and allows site owners to select which subscribers get access to protected areas of their website using server-side content protection. It seamlessly integrates with WordPress and features a host of shortcodes and built-in WordPress functions so you can insert dynamic links and integrate Memberful data with your WordPress theme. Plus, Memberful has built-in connections with popular tools like MailChimp, Discord, and Google Analytics, so site owners can reach and monetize their existing audience without rebuilding their entire tech stack. With Memberful, your clients always have full control and ownership of their audience and their brand. The software also maintains a GraphQL API, webhooks, and OAuth single sign-on to make integration even easier. Memberful has everything your client will need to run a membership program, including a streamlined and powerful checkout system, an easy-to-use member portal, transactional emails, and a member management dashboard. Memberful's analytics give your clients an easy-to-use, in-depth view of what's working, what's not, and where you should double down. Help your clients monetize their passion today. Get started for free at memberful.com. memberful.com/app stories. That's memberful.com/app stories. Our thanks to Memberful for their support of the show.
All right. So do you want to talk about another recent Apple app, Journal?
Yeah, I do. I think Journal is another one that's kind of interesting because it's got a large floating plus button at the bottom, which is something that I think is new. That's very much like the Things app, for instance. Things puts theirs off in the corner. I kind of like how Apple's is right down here in the middle because for an iPhone app, that's the place you want it for your thumb. It makes it, it works whether you're holding it in your left hand or your right hand. And again, we've got kind of a card-like interface, although this is a little bit different design because you've got big cells in the main view that are combining multiple kinds of media. You got your text that you've typed, as well as images and other rich media, whether it's, workout details or music or whatever it happens to be. And I can't say that I've used this app a lot yet. I put it on my home screen to give it a try. But I really do like how it's presented. I do think that this app, and this goes less to the design, but more to the app itself. It's really it's designed in a way to make it easy to get started, which I really appreciate because you don't have to feel like you have to write 1,000 words about your day. You can write a couple of paragraphs or even a couple of sentences, and then just throw some images on there, and you'll go back in a month or two, and you might remember. Oh, I remember when I went on that nice fall walk and went and had the coffee at the coffee shop and things. I'm looking at mine right now, and that's what I did. It's like here's a day that I went for a walk with Jennifer, and we saw some nice fall foliage, and then we went to the coffee shop and had something to eat and went home. And it was just kind of nice to remember back to that November day.
Yeah. A couple of things that I want to mention about Journal. Another instance of a button in the main view that has a shape around it. This is the filter button that lets you select different types of entries, and also a card-based UI, so that every entry in the journal sort of looks like its own little page. And when you tap on an entry that has more text that can fit in the preview, the card expands. So this is also a very nice animation, and there's a different look for the action buttons that you get when you swipe on a card. So those are combined with haptic feedback, but they are, these are different from the swipe actions that you see, for example, in Mail. These are circular, larger buttons with some, accent colors and a white glyph inside. I like it. I think, from design perspective, it's a really polished, minimal app. It looks really cool.
Yeah, we're gonna get to this in a second when we talk about visionOS, but I really do think you're starting to see with some things like those pill-shaped buttons and these circular buttons, you're really starting to see a more rounded UI coming through on the iPhone that's very much like we have in visionOS.
Yeah, the other thing I will mention about Journal is that I think right now it is a very simple app. But I feel like it really has the potential to sort of become the the inbox for Apple apps on your device. Like when you're able to capture from photos, from music, from podcasts, from people you've had a phone call with. This idea of Journal sort of acting as an inbox to capture all relevant bits of data and patterns about how you use an iPhone. I think that's really fascinating, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is something that we'll see more and more in iOS 18 if, and it seems pretty much a given, Siri will gain new AI features. I'm thinking, for example, what if there's a Siri chatbot in iMessage in iOS 18 and you're able to sort of create a log, create a conversation with Siri by being like, hey, can you save the latest message that I've sent in Mail, or can you copy can you make a note of the task that I just completed in Things? Like this idea of capturing bits and pieces from different apps and having a log, having a chronological entry of the data that you've captured from apps with the deep link into that source app. I think this is something that we could also see, in addition to Journal, in a more conversational Siri that is capable of storing and presenting new information when you talk to it.
Yeah, and I would like to see stuff in Journal that's kind of combines both location and event information. And I was immediately thinking about the sports app that we just talked about. It's like, well, what if my phone recognizes that I'm actually at the event that I'm looking at, for one of my favorite teams in sports? Why not drop a card in there with the results of the game? And then you can, combine it with some photos and maybe some thoughts about your outing. And that could be kind of fun too.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about visionOS.
Yeah, visionOS. All right. I guess the place that I want to start with, because I actually enjoy it a lot, is the new notification center with its card UI, which I think fits a lot with the card UIs that we were just talking about in these other two apps. You tap on the control center, it opens up, you tap on notifications, and then you get a row of square boxes with various kinds of notifications that you've allowed through to the system, whether it's emails or messages or whatever it happens to be, and they stack up by app, which I like. You tap on any of those and it opens up however many there might be for your mail app, for instance, and then you can clear them one by one or as a group. And if you go back out to the multiple stacks of various types of notifications, you can clear them all away in one tap if you want to there as well. And I've actually found myself using notifications far more when I'm using visionOS than when I'm on my iPhone or even on my Mac, because I don't know, there's something about that UI that just really clicks with me.
It makes sense, I think, for visionOS to have a horizontal notifications UI, because the Vision Pro is a horizontal device, right? It's based on your field of view, which is something that your eyes perceive horizontally in front of you, and it makes more sense, I guess, on the iPhone, which is a vertical device by and large, to have a vertical notification center.
Yep.
But it is yet another instance of a card UI, which Apple seems to really like these days, and I think this is something we are going to see more and more as Apple iterates on its design language across platforms.
Yeah, I think so. I think cards work particularly well. They scale well to a lot of different sizes of screens, and that's, I think, why we're seeing as many of them as we are, because it just works in a lot of different contexts. And I'm trying to remember back when it was that Maps, I think, was the first app that introduced kind of the slide up detail card, and that's been quite a few years now.
So which is now that's now a developer API. The developers can implement those sort of sheets that pop up from the bottom. Yeah.
Right. What else do we want to talk about?
I think I want to talk about those expanding tabs.
Yes, absolutely.
So visionOS has these sidebars that typically are collapsed, but when you look at them, obviously with your eyes, they expand to reveal the text label. So by default, you just see the icons, but when you look at the icons, that they expand to reveal the text label. So for example, on the home screen, you get the icons for apps, people, and your environments, and when you look at those controls, they expand to reveal like the full text labels of those items. And this is something that you can see in tons of other places with these collapsed sidebars that can be expanded to navigate.
Right.
I think on one hand, this makes a lot of sense for an operating system that is controlled by your eyes, because you have the natural hover effect of your eyes sort of looking at something, hovering, quote unquote, over it with your gaze for a few seconds, and then the OS reacts to your sight and expands the item. Obviously, this wouldn't make much sense on a phone because it's not like you can hover with your finger over a UI element.
Right.
But it maybe does make some sense for the other two, three operating systems that support the concept of hovering, which is tvOS, iPadOS, and macOS. Now, would you like to see, when you're working with your Mac, a collapsed sidebar that takes a second every time you hover with the mouse over it to expand? Probably not. But there's still potential, I think, for having a proper API in place for developers who maybe sparingly can decide to have this sort of animation on a desktop operating system.
Right, right. And I think that would really, I think to be effective, it would have to be very finely tuned for the length of the animation and things like that. I'm thinking about already, like when you have to expose in preview, for instance, the little file widget at the top of the in the toolbar, the toolbar or the title bar, to drag something out of a title bar on a Mac. People complained forever about that animation, and it is, you can speed it up now, but yeah, I think people are pretty picky about that kind of stuff. I actually would kind of like it, because one of the things I like about visionOS, and I talked about this a little bit in my review of GameTrack 5.4, which is on visionOS, is that that's a really information dense app that is displaying lots of data to you, and having those controls kind of fade into the background on the sides is actually really nice. Now, you're right. I think the implementation has to be different if it's on a Mac or maybe on an iPad in windowed mode. But I think there are ways that it could be done, and be done effectively on those platforms too.
Yeah, I think so too. Obviously, the elephant in the room with visionOS, I think, is the idea of depth and shadows.
Yep.
Now, I don't think I've seen a lot. Have you seen that rumor saying that iOS 18 will have a visionOS inspired redesign?
I have, yes.
I don't think that's gonna be the case. visionOS is designed the way it is because, first of all, you're dealing with windows represented as physical objects in your world, and so those objects, they can overlap with other windows. They can overlap with with physical objects in your real life, and they cast shadows, so to sort of keep you grounded in your space. Now, when you're looking at an app on your phone, that's not a physical object in space. It's a virtual window on screen. And so I don't think it will make sense for an iOS app to cast a realistic looking shadow where exactly. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. And similarly, I don't think it makes a lot of sense for iOS windows to be made of the material that Apple calls glass on visionOS. Windows on visionOS are composed with this UI material called glass, because they're meant to be reflective and to be translucent, so that they can show you a little blurred preview of what's behind them, for example. I don't think these elements make a lot of sense for iOS or iPadOS, but there's always a but with this.
There is a but. Yeah.
I think it makes sense to sort of move away from. It's been 11 years since the iOS 7 redesign.
I know where you're going. I'm glad you're going this way, because I was going to say I mostly agree with you, but, and this was going to be my but too.
I think it makes sense to start reincorporating some sense of layering for UI element on the Z-axis, if you will, to have some sense of depth for things like buttons, for things like sheets that are presented on top of other windows. So to have a slightly more pronounced sense of depth in the iOS UI, and Apple has been doing this in bits and pieces over the past few years. But maybe to start doing it a little bit more now that we have visionOS, and now that it's been over a decade since the uber minimalism of iOS 7. That's probably a good time to do it.
Yeah, iOS 7. That was my first WWDC. It's been a really
one for the ages.
Yeah, it's been a really long time, and I agree with you. I think it doesn't make sense to have apps become objects on a lot of these platforms, but I think that there is room to differentiate, particularly between content and controls. So, I can see buttons having a little bit more of a drop shadow, feeling a little more raised off the surface of the app itself, just by use of various 3D animations and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think I think it'll be fun to have a little bit of that back. I'm not advocating for rich Corinthian leather.
No.
Or, I don't know, or pinstripes even. But I do think that we should have a little more color and depth in our devices. And I think that's another thing that I want to mention is color, because I think that is very much on the forefront of the sports app. I think that the journal app, a little more muted in its color tones, but still uses a combination of colors that I think bring a vibrancy to that app that a lot of Apple's other ones don't. And I can see more of that kind of extending throughout the OS as well.
Yeah. The last UI element I want to mention is those sort of sidebars or pickers that sort of open on the right side of a visionOS window. So, for example, when you're using the Messages app on visionOS and you want to send a photo to someone, the photo picker opens on the right side, sort of like an inspector panel almost.
Yep.
And those sidebars on the right, those windows on the right, I think are an interesting decision. Again, they make sense. If you look at visionOS, you see these elements that really take advantage of the horizontal form factor of the Vision Pro, right? If you think about it, everything expands on the
sides.
on the x-axis on visionOS, right, to the sides, because humans have eyes next to each other in a horizontal layout, if you will.
Right.
That's, we don't have the eyes on top of each other. We have them on the sides. So it makes sense for the visionOS UI to be a constant expansion and expanding and collapsing horizontally. I still think that approach of presenting and almost like a picker or an inspector panel as something that slides out to the side of the window, I think that's an element that could potentially make sense on the iPad, especially if you're using Stage Manager, which is currently unable to support that kind of animation. iPad apps running with Stage Manager can just spawn a new window, but that window always opens on top of what you're doing, therefore obscuring what you're doing. And I think it would be much more interesting to have a window that can be spawned on the side, so not covering the main app, but covering something that was already in the background.
Right,
so,
and something that's narrow and kind of constrained to lists and things like that.
Yeah, so I think that element could make sense in the context of Stage Manager. But that's about as far as I could push it in terms of like, what does visionOS suggest for the future of Apple design? There are some undercurrents of things that could make sense, but all these concepts and mock-ups that we're seeing of iOS looking exactly like visionOS, I think that's more of an exercise in Figma or Photoshop or whatever the kids are using these days.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But I do want to return just briefly to the rounded edges of visionOS, because I think that everything is a lot more rounded off in visionOS, whether it's buttons or windows or whatever it happens to be. There are no hard corners. And, we've got that in apps like Sports and in Journal, which we already talked about. But we've also got it in places like the dynamic island, which has been around now for more than a year, right? I mean, that's that dynamic island. That's your pill shape right there, Federico. It's your pill shape button right up at the top. So I think that those kind of rounded corners make more sense on the Mac and on the iPad, where there's a little bit more screen real estate, and wasting the corners is okay. I think it probably makes less sense on an iPhone, but still, I do expect we'll see a little bit more of a rounding off of and a more organic look to those other OSs when we get our hands on them in the summer at WWDC. All right, Federico, I think that's a good conversation for today. Why don't we end it there?
Yeah.
I want to thank our sponsor again. That is Memberful. You can find the two of us over at macstories.net. We're on Mastodon too. Just go to viticci.macstories.net or johnvorhees.macstories.net or both to follow us on Mastodon. We're also on Instagram and Threads. Federico is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.